Very good. It's 1:30, so we will begin the EDIC meeting for today. And I hope everyone appreciates that we have a round table because you requested that. So, oh no, it's a rectangle. I apologize. Anyway, we did the best we could with your request. So we just have a couple items on the agenda. So we'll begin with number one, to approve the Tax Exempt Review Committee meeting minutes for 6/27/23, 7/18/23. 7/25/23 and 8/15/23, and everybody has had ahead of time, hopefully, but if there are any changes or corrections, otherwise we will accept a motion.
Move to approve.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any other comments? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. And now we'll have our discussion, and I do appreciate yesterday we had an excellent group at the HBA with the developers, and so want to thank you, everybody that attended yesterday, and thank you for being here today. I thought it was a very good discussion, and so I appreciate you being here today, so hopefully we can continue that. And I think what we'll do is maybe have you just kind of summarize that at some point, but we'll just start out with, and Mayor, I don't know if you had any comments you wanted to start us out with, but okay.
I think, Dave, you were at the meeting for most of the meeting yesterday. I'd just be curious. I did see Alex Christensen send an email out. I don't know if all the team got that email. Okay, we got that. And there were some recommended suggestions, and I just think the committee has to know. Last night at commission, Commissioner Strand recommended that we review all our policies with the commission present, so that would bring 5 commissioners in a room with us at some point in the future. So my assumption is today we're going to kind of just talk policy, some things we might want to tee up for that group. Would be fair, Dave?
And so if this is okay with the group, if you wouldn't mind just starting with, you kind of had a list of things that the developers were looking for. And if you don't mind, I'll just jump in real quick right away. One of the things that caught my ear the most was they were supportive of a five-year term, and from the perspective of the city, that's the most palatable from the citizens, I believe, to have a shorter term. That's much more popular than the longer ones, and I know for bigger numbers that might be necessary, but to me that was a positive thing that I was happy to hear that. And so if with that, I don't mean to put pressure on you, but if you would just kind of go through. The other thing is, this is open, even though it's not a round table, it's a rectangle, but feel free, anybody who wants to make comments at any time, feel free.
Dave,
And
can
if
we
you don't
just
mind-
do introductions around the table?
And I apologize. Do you want us to go around and introduce everybody? Would everyone like to? Let's do that, and so then everyone knows. But when you speak, if you wouldn't mind saying who you are too. So I'm Dave Peppercorn, City Commissioner.
Jim Gilmore, City of Fargo.
Austin Moore.
Push. Austin Morris, Enclave Development.
Jessica Ebling, Gate City Bank.
Lucas Paper Grow Investment Group and EDIC committee member.
Timoni, Mayor.
John Cosgrove, oldest serving member of this committee.
Longest.
Yeah, what's the Jimmy Buffett song, Oldest Surfer on the Beach? So,
Kevin Christensen Companies. Alex Christensen Companies as well.
Tim Gleason, Gleason Companies.
Brian Benscoter, Brand Holdings.
Elizabeth Kozel, Home Builders Association.
Blake Nybakken with Epic Companies.
Lance Johnson with Epic Companies.
So with that, we'll begin. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Alex Christensen here again. Had a good conversation yesterday at HBA. Quite a few developers there. Kind of, discussing pilot possible changes at TIF. One of the things that's pretty obvious, there's a lot of interest rates hiking recently, last couple of years, as well as construction costs going up, materials on labor side, and kind of sparked by COVID and continued. So let's talk about that yesterday, and where would it make sense to put incentives? What does Fargo need that we're not getting enough of? What does Fargo have going up without incentives that works without them, or has a need for them, or is overbuilt and doesn't need anymore? So kind of coming from that. So I had about 6 bullet points there. I guess in our current market, there's not really a lack of office, commercial, restaurants, hotels in Fargo. In fact, there's a lot of vacancies in those areas. You'll see vacant strip malls, vacant mixed-use first floors. obviously offices with work from home, kind of that trend going. Hasn't been too bad for Fargo, not as bad as big markets, but they're still real. And then as far as other, other projects that are going forth without incentives, we're breaking ground on hotels. Restaurants continue to pop up where it makes sense. Retail, if something's full, they'll build something next to it on spec, whatnot. But the one kind of glaring thing is housing. I think there's a housing study came out, said 13,000 units for the next 10 years. Obviously, home buyers are feeling a squeeze, being able to afford their mortgage payments. And on the other hand, us as developers, obviously, numbers are getting tighter, especially on the high density. It comes cost. And so how do we put together a program to kind of encourage housing and density going forward? As far as the density goes, obviously there is a definitive boundary now. Fargo can't keep growing unless you want to do another diversion down the road. Don't know how that looks. And then, let's see, along with the density, there's other people in the market that don't want to live in downtown or high rises. There's people that want yards and live in Fargo because they want their own yard and space. So I think it's just a mix of, demand as well, and it can't all be high density, but understand to encourage it going forward. But there's obviously, as far as planning goes, you got to kind of take into account every kind of home buyer and what they're looking for, whether it is a condo, apartment, townhome, fourplex, single family, large lot, all those there's demand for. I guess as far as qualifying for incentives, we think the project should be properly capitalized to begin with, which can be defined as equity as a percentage of the project cost, financially feasible without an incentive. These projects shouldn't be happening because the city basically subsidizing to happen. We think they can happen, and then also once the TIF goes away or pilot goes away, you want to make sure it's financially feasible. So I think just keeping in mind that these projects should go forward regardless, but if there's some kind of spiff to incentivize them to get going, that makes sense, especially with kind of stabilization ramp up, getting enough residents and occupancies on the commercial side as well. So given that, if it is financially feasible, it should be short term, not to exceed 5 years, maybe even doing something like year one, 100% tax abatement, and then 80, 60, 40, 20, kind of tapers off, kind of in accordance with ramp up. Guess what other, yeah, and as far as if you are doing high density, I think you got to pay attention to city codes too and make sure they are abiding by those, especially parking. We talked yesterday quite a bit about, I think ultimately we just want things to be properly parked, but also I think underparked is worse scenario than overparked. So I don't know where that goes, but just keep in mind.
Can I jump in real quick? Because we talked about that yesterday, and I think that's an important thing, that we make sure that our planning and growth plans are complementary to this. I think that was what we brought up, that we have to make sure we're on the same page, but also that our rules as far as parking isn't inhibiting what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that's kind of what we talked about. We're redoing that right now. But from the developer's perspective, they were talking about if you don't have enough parking spaces, you're not going to be able to rent your apartments. And from the city's perspective, if we have too much parking, then we're going to have empty looking lots. And that isn't really the most efficient use of the land. So I guess I would be interested to hear what is the number and what are you looking for? But I do think it's different from our experience in the downtown. That's different than it is when it's not in the downtown. So maybe, and I don't know, Jim, if you can talk a little bit about, so the downtown ramps, that's a different, different beast than having an apartment with parking spaces in the not downtown. Does that make sense to you? And maybe, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, definitely downtown, there's probably less cars per people too. But I had a couple other points, so I could just touch on really quick, and then we can kind of open it up. But, part of the proposed pilot that came out had design as a criteria. I mean, everyone likes cool looking buildings, but at the same point, you're also trying to encourage affordability. So I think design more should be driven by, you know, there's going to be some nice apartments that are Class A, there's going to be some Class B and Class C, and I think that's okay. So having design as kind of a criteria for whether it's a pilot or not doesn't really make sense. I think that just be driven by the customer demand. And then also it kind of keeps, you know, affordability at mind. Last part I had was just, you know, if there are mixed-use projects, I think we should look at them as kind of separate components. So if there is if it is a mixed-use building and, you know, floors, you know, 2 to 8 or whatever, 2 to 6 or high density, you want to give it a pilot, I think that should probably just apply towards that portion of the project, as opposed to if that's part of a larger project. I think it just kind of shouldn't be the goal of the policy.
So we had good discussion, Jim. I don't know if you had any comments you wanted to make, but so I have a question, and I apologize for going back to parking, but so to me, do you think we should have different requirements in the downtown than other parts of the town? Does that make sense? I guess that's my question from your perspective.
Didn't prepare for that, but I've actually never lived downtown, so I've always lived in kind of South Fargo, Minneapolis before I did live downtown, and when I lived there, I think about half or 2/3 of people I knew had cars, for example. It's probably a little higher here, but I would think you'd have more cars for people as you move south, although there's children too. I don't know where that gets factored in, but I think part of it's kind of, you know, downtown, maybe you have more businesses that come in and use it during the day and residents at night. You probably get, that's probably not the case also over in South Fargo. You know, I just have an apartment that, you know, it's not being used during the day and it is what it is, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about yesterday was that more of that mixed use, you know, for instance, the Civic Center ramp next to the Radisson, that serves the hotel with 150 rooms, plus we rent out 200 monthly parking spots to downtown office workers, plus we have hourly parking. So, you know, it sort of has, it's probably a lot of the spaces are rented 2.5 times, but we never really get full because everybody's there at a different time. And we may be able to have that in a mixed-use development on the edge too, where an office building shares parking with apartments and people aren't there at the same time. I think also we talked yesterday, and another point you brought up was that we really need to have the growth plan identify where the high-density areas are. You know, we don't want them randomly throughout the city. We want a land use plan that identifies where it's going to be. So someone that buys a single-family home doesn't get a surprise one day and get a large building next to them.
I think Jim's good. It's at Davies High School. We're going to have some more residential go in, and the neighbors actually came and didn't want residential because the pool's packed. And they figured if more residents came into that area, then Davies Pool would be packed. Came to the commission and wanted us to put a 7-Eleven or something there because they felt there wasn't anything around to do that. So I do think that's different. And to Dave's point, I think parking downtown oftentimes hourly park, we make money off of them. But if you're going to do it for residents, we talked yesterday, you can't have too little parking, but I do see now you're sometimes putting in parking in the first floor or basement or doing something else that I think is innovative. On your TIF comment about the 80-60-40, I've always been under the impression that our taxes in some way are so low that the developer doesn't really get a net advantage from that unless it goes 10, 15, or 20 years. And when we first got on the commission, we used to go 20 to 25 years. We've quit doing that. We've probably come down to 15. It seemed that the county now has an arbitrary number of maybe 7, 8 is where they're starting to land and how far they want the TIFs and pilots. But the only thing I see wrong when you go 180 to 60-40 the first 5 years, I don't think you're getting enough horsepower out of that to make a developer really get a benefit out of it because you're cutting it so quickly, their net advantage is really lost. The most popular one we've ever had, and Dave and I, is the Renaissance Zone. It's been wildly popular, 5-year plan, 100%. So I think that has worked, but I do take to your note, sometimes what we've tried to do is what is the developer objective? What do they objectively want to get? They need some help to make a project go, to cash flow. And I think, John, we've looked at now sometimes maybe 5 years, and then the 6 to 10 years, you start to do the taper, or maybe the 10 to 15 years, you start to do some taper. I like the way you're thinking, Alex, in the sense is, can we be a little bit more variable? And that, to me, would be the financial analysis we get, that both of us would understand. You get a benefit, we get a benefit, but we can ease off the pedal maybe a few years sooner than we normally would do. And I think that's a variability Jim would have to look at, but
Yeah,
that,
and I think
that
what-
way to taper it.
What Alex is clarify, I want to clarify that. Our discussion yesterday was more the 5 years would be in a new area. I think everyone acknowledges that trying to redevelop in a brownfield, you're probably going to need that 15 years, and that's still very appropriate.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, you know, when we're looking at the different areas, I think there's been some good discussion about density, about taxable value. And, you know, if there is a desire to limit that, I guess I would just argue that I would think the city would want a tool still to evaluate a special project or something unique that doesn't fit just one or the other. You know, I think there's been a lot of discussion because of the project that we've proposed, and I think we had a very unique structure there that accomplished, or at least as proposed, it would accomplish a lot of the city's goals with, if you look at it holistically, it brings in higher density, higher property tax values if we can fully build it out. And we presented a structure that we felt was kind of a risk-free way that the city could get behind a parking ramp by leveraging future property taxes on just one portion of the development. And then that ramp also had benefit for the zoo, had benefit for the park district and all of their users. So it's maybe not as simple as, you know, just a density or just a taxable value component, but to have the ability to have a special project like this that how it was presented in its final form was just for a ramp. There was no property tax dollar savings going into the water park project itself, but they were being leveraged to pay for half of a ramp essentially. So I just think that would be an important part of the discussion that, you know, as this group, the EDIC unanimously approved our project moving forward. I think they saw the merits and the benefits to the city moving forward with a project like that. So having a policy that could support it if something like that comes up. I mean, I think, you know, maybe some previous projects that weren't looked at or weren't qualified under the existing TIF could benefit from that in the future if something else came up, so.
I think we're talking about almost two different policy changes. One that would just encourage that higher density residential. The other, and I think Tim Gleason brought up a good point to me on the phone today. You know, I've been calling this public-private partnerships, and really term more of a special projects might be a better approach in terms of, do we want a policy so when we have these, you know, unique special projects that might come up, does the city want to get involved and to probably leave a lot of flexibility depending on that particular project. So I want to get, you know, the committee's thoughts on that. And I don't know, Tim, you want to add anything, you know, to that?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. But yeah, my only thing was, I think I agree with Alex on the struggles with housing economics today to get those numbers to pencil. It's extremely challenging, and all of us see that in our financial analysis. So I think the housing side is one discussion, but the original policy proposed is more of an adaptation on the current P3 policy, which is very subjective the way it's written today. And so if you take that and adapt that to more of a specialty project discussion, and what's the ultimate goals of the city to achieve those specialty projects, and what are the metrics and kind of the economic impact of those specialty projects. So kind of, I think they're two parallel discussions and two different policies. So.
Any other, I'm not going to start calling on people, but I hope this is a time to give your perspective. Go ahead, John.
Well, excuse me, we go back in the history of the whole Tax Exempt Review Committee and then Economic Development Incentive Committee. And the basic reason to do any type of tax abatement, tax exemption, is to build a higher tax base in the future. And so where we're headed with these policies, when I first heard, a parking ramp in a green field, I went, no way. I mean, you can understand the old urban renewal where you've got a challenge site and dilapidated buildings and run down and incenting that going forward. The thing that started to move me towards this was that trade-off, because we're talking high density, and then on the other side we're talking, but here's the parking requirement. And so as we look at these type of policies, to me it always just comes down to what's the amount of taxes foregone for what period of time, and what taxable value do we get at that point in the future? And I think we're kind of working towards that, but the ramp seems to be kind of the easiest one to conceptualize. If you have a parcel of land, and that parcel of land is going to be all surface parking, it's going to have a very low taxable value. If we can work with the developers and take 1/3 of the land and have a 3-story ramp build, and then the remaining 2/3 of that land gets additional tax benefit, taxable value built on it, then it starts to make sense for the city. And that's kind of what we've looked at all along in all these different iterations of this whole thing. And so I don't like, and Alex, I don't, things like style get really scary, and trying to mandate different things like that. But from the city standpoint, I think we just have to keep going back and saying, if we forego taxes today, what's it do to our tax base in the future? And does it make sense?
Well, Alex, I appreciate you putting this together because I think it actually is a good summation of the conversations we've been having probably for the past 6 weeks. What's interesting to me is there is 2 different conversations that we're having right now. One is 3 probably. One is special projects, special community projects that, without the city being involved or multiple city entities are interested in being involved, we can make that happen and it's of community benefit. There's projects in blighted areas that may or may not be, or that would not be viable but for city help. And then there's how do we continue in the short term, I would say, to incent building given the current interest rate environment effectively. And so that's interesting to me to say, hey, we have X amount of units or X amount of density that we need to hit in the next 10 years in order for us to fulfill the amount or to reach our goals. Then you look at the map of Fargo and you say, hey, well, we're landlocked now. And so let's circle these areas for this density and these areas for this density. And this is going to be high density, this is going to be medium density, this is going to be low. And the blended average equals the amount of density that we're going to need in order to meet our goals, right? That's what would be really interesting to see from the planning team. But outside of that, effectively what this is just an interest rate buy down in a lot of ways. The developers are saying, hey, at 7%, there's no way this is going to work. We can't find the money and the cash flow is not going to be there. We are asking as developers, can the city help us buy down that risk in the short term so that we can help build towards that density goal until the market reacts in a way that actually allows you to make these projects viable on their own, which makes a lot of sense to me. Is how is that going to be perceived by the public? That's also interesting. But I think if we're saying, hey, there's a threshold, and if it's 40 units, 50 units, I'm not sure what the actual number would be per acre, you get this incentive because you are, especially within whatever zoning that it happens to pertain to for, as far as density is concerned, then like, hey, you're going to build towards this density where we want it, and in the time frame, in the short term, so we can meet our goal in the next 10 years. It all makes sense to me. So I appreciate you putting that together, and I think it's the simplest and most succinct way you can actually do it. I would love your thoughts on anybody else who's developers in the room on that. We haven't heard a lot directly as it pertains to these points. So
I think part of it is just subjectivity and just making things objective. You got a number of unit, we threw on 35, 40 units an acre, and anything above that's considered high density. Whatever the number ends up being, I think design's very subjective. I think just policy should get pretty objective. That's why it's been primary sector in the past. It's pretty obvious what that is, although maybe today it's some more gray what it is. But in the past, it's been pretty crystal clear. And the redevelopment makes total sense. Blighted areas, it needs the help. And, it's not our forte what we do, but we respect what everyone does downtown here. It's a great environment.
I can provide, excuse me, I have a cold, as you can hear my Johnny Cash voice. So bear with me. But I can touch on 3 projects that we've done outside of market that would touch on 3 different types of incentives, if you want to characterize it as an incentive, but an economic feasibility tool that the communities that we work in utilize. We have one example where we built 220 units in suburban Metro Greenfield, no incentive, and it was all housing. Then we have another example that was a redevelopment project, which we've touched on. This is in Bloomington. It was a blighted project. It got certified as blighted. And the city wants to incentivize density on blighted sites, and that was about 165 units. And that got us, through the process, a redevelopment TIF. They layered on and asked for some additional units, probably 10% that were deemed affordable at 60% AMI within the marketplace. That grew the TIF amount that we were able to achieve in order to make the project feasible with that requirement. And then we had a third example, which is kind of different than both of those two, in that it was an area within a community where they wanted density, they had limited land left, and they essentially incentivized density. And they incentivized density through a real estate tax abatement on a pro rata basis based on how many units would have typically been built there had they not incentivized it. It was probably more like 25, 26 units per acre. We were probably at closer to 40 after meeting with them and working through what they, the city wanted from a tax base protection measure long-term. We didn't get a full real estate tax abatement. We got probably roughly half was reduced by doing a much more expensive project that was probably 25, 30,000 a unit more expensive to get that density and still achieve rental rates within the community that were within or even close to market. Had we built that without the incentive, nobody would have built it because it wouldn't have worked financially. I find it interesting because those are three examples. Minnesota's unique in that it has redevelopment TIF or housing TIF. Not trying to compare Minnesota to North Dakota, but they do have it from a policy guidance perspective. This conversation is important because they do have it down to a guided policy standpoint where you upfront know what you could conceivably achieve based on the playbook, and you sort of know what you're getting into when you pursue projects like that. They all go through either Baker Tilly, PFM, or another third-party feasibility service that the city hires independent of us. And these projects aren't, what's neat to watch is over the past few years when we've developed roughly 1,000 units in the 46 metros within Minneapolis, is none of the projects that received incentives compared to the projects that didn't receive incentives resulted in material benefit to private investors from a return standpoint. It's not like we developed this and, oh gosh, I'm glad we got that incentive because we hit it out of the park. We doubled our return. So I think from my experience, their process is working from ensuring that most of the time, the incentive that we feel that we need is actually greater than the incentive we actually are given based on the review from third-party feasibility. This conversation, to me, is interesting. I like the idea of having sort of a playbook that you could review their criteria. Do I qualify on enough areas to pursue some form of incentive? And I think where it's different is, from my standpoint, is do private investors materially benefit as a result of the policy in a fashion that's maybe less equitable from a competitiveness standpoint in the marketplace? And that's where, when I think through this, and I go through the sort of rubric that Jim shared, I think of facilities nationally that probably historically 90% of facilities that are truly public benefit facilities are publicly incentivized. And I would say if you found almost any stadium, any convention center, any large format building where public is invited to participate. That's something that's been going on for decades and decades. So I naturally gravitate toward if a situation warrants because of quality, unique nature, character, and density, and that it serves the community from a diversity of income perspective, from a diversity of participation, whether it be localized, but hopefully, I think one of the things in there is tourism. If the reach goes outside of Fargo and creates economic impact in a big way or has conceivable benefit that way, it's worth looking at in the special project format. And I even think I talked to Jim about this a couple weeks ago. I was like, should the Fargo Dome have, and I'm going to get off on a tangent, so just ignore it, but should the Fargo Dome have a parking structure which allows more of the land area to be developable? From my standpoint, I think that's, in that format, that's something that's worthy of looking at. Should the All Sports Complex, which took up a ton of land, and if it's a nonprofit status and it's not generating any real estate tax revenue, should that have been looked at differently where we'd have more land area to develop in a high density fashion that benefits a very broad community demographic and even broader benefits from tourism? I think that's an interesting discussion. I think for me, the line that's challenging is if it materially makes a project work and a material amount of the benefit ends up getting earned by private investors, that's kind of the line that I have trouble getting past. Whereas for some form of nonprofit, truly public use that engages a wide community demographic and encourages tourism and has high enough economic impact, that seems worthy of discussion and potential support. So I'll leave it there for now.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? So you were talking about in Minneapolis, you got a tax incentive, but then if you had, let's say, affordable housing in, then you got additional? Is that what you said? So do you think that's a good idea?
I think supply, honestly, encouraging supply through productive planning, zoning, and long-term planning, and having a diversity of housing stock and encouraging supply is probably more important than trying to incent your way out of housing challenges. And the other thing I've been touching on that for a couple of years now is if you talk to any community in the United States, you'll commonly hear we have an affordable housing problem. Well, part of that is driven by cost of housing has just gone up. But when I look at Fargo, it comes out every year. There's a couple of different reports that come out that show Fargo remains on a rentership basis within the top 10 most affordable communities in the nation. So that's maybe a totally different topic, but it's kind of interesting when we develop in smaller communities, like we have a project in Richland, Washington, which is similar size to Fargo. It's about 275,000 people. No incentives for affordable housing, but we develop a 3-story walk-up product, no underground parking, clubhouse, and our average rental rate on each of the categories is greater than Fargo by probably $150, $200 per month. And I think part of the increase in rents over the past 3 years as a result of supply being tighter and our market growing, which is awesome, creates sort of the idea that there's a big affordable housing problem. I think within any community, there's going to be a challenged portion of it, which is probably 40% AMI below, that you'll find it challenging to not have a wait list because low-income housing tax credits are limited. So I don't know. I think supply wins. I think when you look at our community's median income and the average rent people pay on a market rate, even a new product, Usually, if I look at it compared to HUD's guidelines, I go, that's interesting. 50% of our unit types qualify as being productive for 60% AMI. So.
Anybody else with comments?
A quick question for you, Austin. You said there's a few kind of outside consulting firms that look at your Minneapolis projects. Was there like a stress test that went through, like you can charge this much for your construction management fee, you have to have at least this much capital, your loan has to be at least this long of an AM. So obviously you can kind of tweak numbers and make it say you need it. But I'm curious how I looked at that.
Yeah, I would say obviously we go in fairly realistic and fairly realistic on what we think project cost will be, down payment, interest rate, because we know that in the end, most of those firms process so many of them that they have a pretty darn good pulse on the market. So if we put in there that rates are 7.5% or 7.75 or something, they would bump it down to what they believe market is. But the challenge with that is that different groups have different financing capabilities, different investor groups, and so there is some difference depending on who's bringing the deal. Somebody might need an incentive because they can only get 8% debt, but they always graduate it down to where market is, and I think overall they do a really good job of it.
Yeah, because part of my issue was like with Epic's projects, they're coming at 22% equity, a bunch of subordinate debt, and their banks need a 1.5 debt coverage. So they're looking at 10-year TIF to get that coverage, or 17-year initially. So I just kind of wonder how, I could probably, like I told you, I could say we need help on every project we do if we didn't have enough equity. So I don't know about that. We talked about a stress test and what makes sense for parameters, and I think that should be applied for both of these potential deals we're looking at.
Yeah, I think from a project standpoint today, it seems like 35% down payment is the norm now, where it used to be maybe more like 25% down. But if we were to layer on mezzanine debt or subordinate debt, I think they would adjust for that. So.
Well, Jim, maybe you can address it, but we use PFM, and I think on that project, careful, I'm remembering now, but I think, Alex, they backed it down from 20 to a 10-year.
Yeah, their assumption.
I still agree with you that.
Their assumption was that they would refinance after year 10 when the pilot went off, and at that point it would work because it was undercapitalized to begin with. That was PFM's analysis.
And the 150% debt service coverage was, seemed really high. But I think PFM as a whole has, and Jim, you can kind of address it, I think gotten more refined and closer to market probably than.
The developers had requested, 17-year property tax exemption, and the PFM review was that 10 years should be sufficient because they could either bring in more equity or some subordinate debt. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think it helped us make a good decision on what to offer.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that, I mean, I think it's getting a little bit misconstrued as to what the ask was for. The original ask was for what do we need to fund the public parking ramp? And so originally our request was an abatement in the size that would totally cover the cost of a parking ramp. The city told us there wasn't an appetite for that, but maybe something like 10 years would be palatable. We got it down to 17 with our second request, but again, the dollars from that property tax savings were not coming into our project to make it cash flow or anything like that. It was to build almost a $13 million public parking ramp. So it's a little different than when we're looking at another public parking ramp, maybe that's been supported in a downtown setting where the city owns it. They put in $4 million up front. They fund a $350,000 annual shortfall for the project. We were saying we don't need any of that, but if we leverage our future tax savings, we can finance it with this project and then we can do all of the density and everything else in the development that we proposed as part of the project. So I think it's a little bit, it's not as clear as, you know, I think PFM did a good job analyzing it. I think if you look at it in bits and pieces, it's kind of easy to maybe twist or make the data seem like the project wasn't capitalized or was underfunded, or it has some other issues. Again, there's no dollars from what we proposed in this specific project going into the water park. It was for the 500 space public parking ramp that we were proposing as part of the entire development. Now, we've demonstrated and we're moving forward with, can the project move forward without it? Absolutely. But then there's repercussions of it. The buildings that were there are now going to be parking. So, and there's going to be a direct cause and effect. That density is going to go from 44 units a site on an acre on one site down to 0. It's going to get reduced on another site where our first building demonstrated that we could do over 60 units an acre. And that taxable value is going to go down from $24 million in one spot down to 0. Or if it's, you know, $5,000 a parking stall, you know, the annual property taxes are going to be $5,000 a year instead of over $300,000 a year. So there's going to be a direct correlation to density. But again, it wasn't that our project was underfunded. We're not undercapitalized. You know, it's not like our return is going to jump up. PFM analyzed all of that stuff as part of their underwriting of the project. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that, as we're not talking about the policy so much as our project. So,
since we're talking about your project, could you just explain how the public parking works when you needed a variance
yeah.
of 300 units just to support your hotel and your water park, which are private businesses? I don't know how it becomes a public parking structure.
Well, so the parking ramp was sized so that there, in addition to what was needed for our entire development, there was additional spaces being constructed.
But you requested a variance of 300 parking stalls just to make the project work.
Yeah, as part of our PUD, because that's going from the base level zoning ordinance of what would be required to what we've demonstrated through our parking studies, where how mixed use turns over and you don't need to build as much parking. So
I guess my question is, how much is available for the public, and how does that work when your project isn't supported per code parking wise already? My big rub is, I mean, I'm all over tax incentives for high density and housing. That's great. Special projects, that's too vague in my world. I don't know what special projects are. Hotels are not a special project. A parking ramp, if it's used to create more density in housing, that's great. That's a need the city has. Another hotel is not. You know, and if it is, then the investor can take the risk and do it themselves.
right, but
That's my rub, okay? I think it's good to stay focused on what the real need is for the community and have the taxpayers buy into what it is. They don't want to buy in. You're a hotel operator, you don't want to buy into a tax incentive for another hotel. Just think about it.
Yep.
You'd feel the same way.
We just broke ground on one ourselves privately, just for the record too, Spring Hill down by Switchets Kingpins.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the specific ramp that we proposed, it was sized where the need for the development, if fully developed, there was still, I believe, 130 stalls in addition to it that were being constructed. So it wasn't like we were counting on all of those stalls and trying to double use them or anything like that. But to address the first point on the parking, again, we went through the PUD process with the city. We worked with planning and zoning for many, many months, and we worked with Walker Parking Consultants to demonstrate. They do a true demand-based study on our whole site, and we tried to project every use, every type of unit that was going to go in every building holistically, and we came up with a number. We developed this 16 acres. Here's what your true demand is going to be. So that's what the city accepted as, yep, you can develop the entire property with this amount of parking. And it was just a variance through the PUD. But then we updated that because the water park wasn't part of that project originally. So we updated that as part of our study, updated the demand, and that's what we were trying to proceed with. And again, it's not like the water park project that's receiving the abatement. It's not like those dollars are going to the investors or anything like that. I think PFM demonstrated that. Those property tax savings were being leveraged to finance 100% the parking ramp. And I think at the 10-year rate, it covered about half of the parking ramp.
Yeah, if I was to circle us back around, we're talking about multiple different motivations for this community to be great. And even though it is an elusive concept to have a special project, I've been on this committee long enough to know that there isn't a clean box that everyone fits in. And that if we can come up with some parameters or some ways to do enough due diligence that we can show to the, our residents and citizens that we've improved the tax base. Well, what I still think we need to do is come back around and continually educate them on what has happened, what projects have been approved, how much of a benefit has it been, because you might only watch the hot topic for one program, one incentive, and then not follow again for a decade. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be constantly talking about what the holistic nature of incentives have done for this community, which is significant. Some of them aren't even old enough to know what some of the buildings were incentivized for. I mean, a lot happens over the course of so many decades. And I think one of the elements that we need to march towards is that continually go and update what projects are rolling on, what's currently happening, and what rolls off to a holistic nature to say anyone at any time in the entire community can go on and look at what the total impact has been, whether you agree with it or you don't, where the projects fit, so that we can all have a better educated discussion instead of slivers of time that sometimes get more press than others, because it's bigger than that. So if we can find certain types of policies, because they're not all going to fit together, but we can come up with the criteria that's appropriate for each one, I think that's our best method forward. But we have a public that doesn't have time to keep up and understand every single project and every single reasoning. So we need to lay that out for them moving forward.
Jim, we do have a lot of that information, but that is a good point to show where are we, how many have matured, what's active right now, and so we do have a lot of that available.
Yeah, and I do plan to provide some report, and probably could work with Mike on the pilots. I've got some good information on the TIF projects. You always like that chart that shows all the ones that have expired, but we've got some others that are kind of nearing that end, and you're right, they happened 15 years ago, and we may not have remembered them. And I think that's important information to look at as we, if our current policy is working well, then we don't want to, change something that's going to, make it worse, but we can certainly try to make it better. So I can work with Mike. Maybe we can kind of get some preliminary info ready for the next meeting, because you have information on that goes way back on how many projects have received pilots and what their values are today.
Yeah, and I think,
But we have done that and so we will get a kind of updated, because that is good. My philosophy is this is a very powerful tool, and we have to be careful how we use it, because we're using our public money, and we've had a good track record, and so we want to continue that. But from the developers, we have to be consistent. So when you talk about special projects, that makes me a little nervous, because I think everybody wants to know, what are the rules and what do I need to do? And everyone wants to be treated equally. And so I know it's tempting to say, well, we have some special projects, but that makes me nervous, because then that's kind of like, then we're saying you have to do this all the time, except when we don't feel like it. And that's, I don't really, do you know what I mean? And there's probably a lot of good things, and that would be everyone's own perspective. That's what makes me nervous. And so I would much rather have this try to be as consistent and across the board as possible. Because I do think that's what individual developers, hey, they are looking out for themselves, and I don't blame them. And so they want to make sure that everyone else has to follow what they follow. I don't know if that's speaking for you, but that's kind of what we're looking for.
Yeah, I think we can, have those examples, and I think maybe spend some time at the next couple of meetings looking at that in conjunction with some of these different policies we're talked about here. I think Lucas made a good point. We just kind of get those redevelopments. What do we do for high density? And then are we going to have a special, project? John Cosgrove, when he was a city commissioner, we worked on this horse park, and this one's a TIF that's finally ending after 25 years. But we do have, community facility that we would not otherwise have had it not been for that redevelopment.
So if you don't mind, I'll just, and we're going to kind of wrap up pretty soon just because I don't want to take too much of your time. But the other thing is this is kind of all new information that you proposed today. So I think what I want people, we've had good comments. It's been on, we've had lots of people contact. And so once again, if you have comments, forward them to Jim. We have some new people here today. And so if there's things that you want us to look at and try to include, please let us know. But I really appreciate, we've had, and I do think that's why it's important not to rush, because we've had interesting meetings, and I do think we need to have more with different groups of people. So I appreciate the home builders having us yesterday. It was an excellent group, and I think everybody felt like they had a chance to say things, and so I think we need to keep doing that going forward. I hope you feel that way. I guess I'd be interested in your comments, what I said about most people want to have it be consistent. So everybody's has to follow the same rules. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I think for the next meeting, I can take another crack at kind of a draft policy. That one would look at this high density, and another that maybe some kind of metrics. If we want to look at special projects, then we can get your feedback on those specifics.
Well, one thing real quick, Kevin, unless you want to jump in real quick before I.
No, I'm good.
Okay. So I guess Austin said a couple of things I found very interesting. And I think the idea that we can have a playbook to say, all developers, you go to this page. And if you meet these criteria, this is the incentive that you're going to get. Keep it as simple as possible. If you're in this area and you're going to reach this amount of density, this is the incentive that you're going to get. And it's not something, it's not a blank check. You're saying the city is indicating that they want this type of building here. And if you do that, we're going to help you out and we're going to make it feasible. That's one thing. I think the other thing that Austin mentioned, which I don't have any clarity over even after all these meetings we've had, is, hey, we are trying to incent our way out of these problems. What are the policy issues that are there any upstream policy issues like parking and zoning and those types of things that are actually forcing us to incent these types of changes downstream? And I don't know how we talk to planning. I know that we're planning on having them. We just filled out a survey and they're going to make a presentation, is my understanding. But it would be really interesting, even from these folks, to hear, what are the things that are within your considerations as you're trying to build that are, it has to be 10 feet, from whatever in order for this to happen, and it's 8 feet, and so therefore we can't make this high enough density. And I know that there's conversations happening in all of your projects as you're planning them and trying to make it happen. So are there things we can do from a policy perspective to say we don't have to reduce the amount of taxes we're collecting on these? We just have to make it easier for them to build higher density projects.
Yeah, I think this whole growth plan will identify areas where that high density can be, and maybe it's higher than. I looked at our present zoning code. The sort of maximum number of housing units you can build is 24 per acre. Unless you do underground parking, then you can get 30. Well, we've heard of all these examples where people have gone higher, and so rather than run people through a special review process that takes 6 months, is there a way we could adjust the land development code in the future to make that more predictable and easier to implement? Because I know time is the major factor to the developers if they're trying to get something done and you miss a construction season. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dave, I applaud the commission. I know you guys as staff have a huge task, but if you're going to look at all the incentives, I think it's appropriate over time that you do that. And 20 years ago, I remember our zoning and everything had kind of gotten out of touch with what was happening. So just about every project came in as a PUD. And we talked then about a developer should be able to come in and say, what's the zoning, what can be done here? In the same way with the incentives, so that it can be consistently applied. But I still go back to that the city's role in this is a trade-off between tax dollars today and tax dollars tomorrow. And that what we're looking to do is maximize the tax base. And that becomes our focus at all times. And there are times when we make mistakes and the tax dollars given up haven't probably generated. But overall, when we look at all the programs, we've seen tremendous step-ups in taxable valuation. And so, you know,
And I
that's
think
great.
real quick, John, the other thing that's given us perspective is now we have finite borders, especially to the south, that we didn't have before. And so then I think that brings more urgency to have a complete growth plan vision for that whole area. Because, and I do think it's going to develop so quickly that if we don't have it organized ahead of time, we'll be playing behind.
Well, with a defined area from the diversion, this will take a few years, but the redevelopment of even neighborhoods, if you simply look around the lakes area and look at what's happening around various lakes in the Minnesota areas as smaller, older places are bought, and 2 or 3 and larger places built, if we're truly confined in space, that's a whole nother program that we'll have to figure out, but.
I'd just say, the one thing with our current, just, I think, demand for units will improve rents, higher incomes in our community as we continue to improve jobs base, will improve affordability, but just changing allowable density, say we increase it to 50 units per acre, a 50 unit per acre project is so much more expensive than a 24 unit per acre. So it's just not feasible without an incentive outside of, in downtown Fargo, it's not feasible without an incentive. So that'd be the other point on the housing front, discussion wise, is if we improve policy to allow higher density and say you choose 50 units per acre for special areas, we couldn't economically make a 50 unit per acre or 60 unit per acre project work today, period, just by being able to do it. Because it's like you go through the per unit cost of these projects. You could go to walk-up product, no garages, you'd be at price point, call it A. Then you go 4-story product, no underground parking, detached garages, your price point B. You go to underground parked 3-story, your price point C. Underground parked outside of the extent of the building, call it 4 stories. We have one of those in Fargo, price point D. And as you inflate that, it's just way more expensive. It's like, do you want to build something for $165,000 a unit that does the same thing from providing units at varied levels from studios all the way up to 3 bedrooms? Or do you want to be dense and be at $265,000 a unit, offering a similar product type? We're not going to get that increased rental rate just by nature. So that'd be an interesting discussion, is what is high density and what incentives is the city comfortable with? Because the one thing that I think people do appreciate about incentives elsewhere that have more flexibility than the state of North Dakota from a TIF standpoint is the city currently was getting $25,000 a year in tax base from the land area that we were developing. With the incentive based on the density provided, they're now getting $265,000. The total tax base might be on an annual basis $500, but the TIF is offsetting that over, say, 15 years. But they're still going in the right direction from an income perspective or a tax base perspective. Yeah, so.
And so I do think one of our next, and not to give you homework, Jim, but I do think meeting with the planning department and then talking about the growth plan, I think that'd be very important, because that's, there's a lot of things that developers would be able to impact and that would help as far as developing. And so, like I said, not to give you homework. And then one more to volunteer, Jim, for if any of you want to meet and talk individually, we'd be happy to anytime. And so Jim's a very friendly guy. I'm not quite as friendly, but if you ever want to meet with us anytime, you let us know. One-on-one, we'd be happy to do that too.
Yeah, we'll get someone from the planning department at one of our meetings to talk about that growth plan as we get that closer to finish. You can kind of see what kind of vision the city commission is trying to achieve, because it's certainly the additional tax revenue, that's sort of our expertise, and their more broader vision of the communities what the planning commission and city commission are looking at.
Is that good for everybody? It's 2:30, so I apologize. That's kind of a long meeting, but thank you for all your input. Thank you for being here. And we will be adjourned till our next meeting. And well, I promise we'll have another rectangular table, so thank you for that. We're adjourned. Have a good afternoon.